the next act, which isn't really an act, but anyway. Derek Winstanley, I'll say it right, even though I've got a Cockney accent, is going to give you a bit of a lowdown on his great cousin, Gerrard Winstanley. That's right. So, over to you, Derek, and the best of luck, matey. And everybody else, be quiet.
Well, at least we've got one person saying Winstanley right, so we're making progress. So I hope you're all still sober enough to appreciate a bit of genuine history about this guy. So I want to tell you about his life, what he did, and what influence Wigan and Wiganers had on his developing his radical views. In a nutshell, he wanted to change society. He wanted to create a totally new society. He wanted to change religion, societal structure, and the economy. So you can't get much more radical than that. And he did two things, basically. He took action, as we've seen earlier on the mains today. He started digging on the common fields west of London. And he also was a very prolific writer. And if it hadn't been for all his scholarly writings, today I don't think we would have known much about this guy, because his diggings on the commons would have gone by the board. It would have been lost in history. So it was all his scholarly writings that we depend upon to know something about him. The diggers were also called the true levellers. They didn't like society, they wanted to level the playing field between the top and the bottom, so they called themselves the true levellers. And there was another group called the levellers that he had a lot of contact with early on. And they also wanted a lot of change, but they never went as far enough to say we need fundamental change. They were willing to make changes within existing social economic structure. And Gerrard Winstanley said, that's not going to work, we've got to turn it upside down, we want fundamental change. So we went from the levellers to the true levellers, who became known as the diggers. All the academic researchers about Gerrard Winstanley recognised that he was probably the most radical person in a very radical world in the 17th century. So the question is, what's the source of his radicalism? And why did he become radical? Where did he get it from? And in all his writings, he never wrote anything about his family. He never wrote anything about his family or Wigan. There's some good reasons for that I'll get to later. So all the academic researchers are focused on what he did in London and his scholarly writings interpreting that. And they all acknowledge they've not been able to penetrate the influence of Wigan and Wiganers on his radicalism. So one of the things I've done is dig much deeper and actually get into what influence Wigan and Wiganers had on his views. And last week I put a new article on Wigan History Search site in the library there. It's a 40-page document detailing all information about his family, his life in Wigan at the time, and relating it to his philosophical views. So you can get this on Wigan History Search. So what do we know about him? We know from the baptism records that started in 1580. There are no birth and marriage and death records prior to 1580. But we're fortunate in Wigan in having those early records. A lot of towns don't have that. So you go back to all those records, and we know that Gerrard Winstanley was born in Wigan, baptised. Well, we know he was baptised at Wigan Parish Church in October 1609. We know in the records his father was given as Edward Winstanley. But without getting into too much detail, the latest thinking for some of the researchers, including myself, that his father was actually Edmund Winstanley. And his father was a mercer, he was a cloth merchant. So one of the things I've dug out from all the historical search is there's a long line of Winstanleys from Winstanley Hall. At about 1490, left Winstanley and went to Prestane in Wales. But why would they do that? Because they got hooked up with John Bradshaw from Bradshaw Hall in Bolton. Bradshaw had established a very successful wool and cloth industry in Prestane. So James Winstanley at the time took some of his family down to Wales, and they became merchants, capitalists, and they made a lot of money there. And 50 years later, about 1555, they returned to Winstanley and built Winstanley Hall. That's where they got the money from, to build Winstanley Hall. So the fact that Gerrard Winstanley's father was a cloth merchant and that Gerrard Winstanley himself became a cloth merchant is really a continuation of all the contacts that the Winstanley family had throughout the country and in London in being cloth merchants. And that's where they got the money. So he was brought up in a very well-connected family. Some of the academic researchers saying he comes from Wigan, all Wiganers are illiterate, and nothing good comes from Wigan. So I said, BS. And I've documented that. So he lived his first 21 years of his life in Wigan, and then he went down to London to the Merchant Tailors Company. Again, Merchant Tailors, that's where he got his training as a cloth merchant. When he was in Wigan, it's extremely likely, I'm almost certain, that he went to Wigan Grammar School, which was founded in 1597. And again, in this article, there's a lot of proof and evidence why I think that's true. So he probably got the best education he could at the time at Wigan Grammar School. I went to Wigan Grammar School too. So when he was in London, it took 7 or 8 years to become a professional cloth merchant, and he became a successful cloth merchant for a few years. He was doing very well, sort of top levels of English society. He got married to a girl who lived in Surrey, and I got married to a girl who lived in Surrey. But the big difference is he stayed with his wife until she passed away, and I divorced my wife from Surrey and moved on. But in 1643 was when he became bankrupt. And that was due to the bad economic situation at the time. There was a lot of famines, the Civil War was on, and he became bankrupt. So after sailing through life fairly smoothly from Wigan Grammar School, Merchant Tailors Company, he hit rock bottom. And that's when he started to think about life and what he should do about it. I'll say a bit more about that. But before I go into any more detail on that, I think it's important just to talk a little bit about conditions in England at that time, in the 1640s, 1650s. And of course that was the time of the English Civil War, 1642, well, the 3 civil wars, 1642 to 1651. So the whole country was in turmoil. The records vary about the number of English people that were killed during the Civil War, but about 200,000 is a reasonable estimate, about 3.7% of the population. So if we transfer that to today's population, if there was a civil war, you would have 2 million dead. That gives you an indication of the scale of the problems in England at the time. And most of the literature described the Civil War as a conflict between royalists and parliamentarians. But there was a lot of other conflicts going on too between different religions. King Henry VIII had separated himself from the Pope and the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. He abolished all the monasteries. And there were a lot of other religions starting up at the same time too, like the Ranters. In January 1649, King Charles I was beheaded. Silence, Sullivan. And the person, here's a link to the Winstanley family I've already talked about. The person that presided over the commission that tried King Charles I and executed him was John Bradshaw. He was the same Bradshaw family that Winstanleys had gone to Wales to become cloth merchants from. So he's a member of the Bradshaw family who was what they call in regicide, accounting for the execution of the king. That was on 30th of January 1649. And it was just 2 months after that when Gerrard Winstanley started digging on the Commons in London. And he started digging on, guess which day? 1st of April. So we might all be conned, I'm not sure about that. But it was the 1st of April. And he started digging the land and sowing crops for the benefit of everybody. And he became very unpopular pretty fast by the locals who were living around there, but also with Cromwell. And Bradshaw, the judge that executed the king, told Cromwell to go and get rid of the diggers, which they did after about 18 months. And there were other diggers groups in other parts of the country too, like Kent, Northamptonshire and Buckinghamshire. So there were probably a couple of hundred of them altogether for about 18 months. So what the diggers were trying to do was get rid of essentially a class society. Get rid of the king, the aristocracy, even the church, the organised church. Very, very fundamental changes. They believed in equality for everybody and sharing all the resources. That's why they dug on the Commons as an expression, a symbolic expression that those resources should belong to everybody. And one thing that Gerrard Winstanley did in one of his pamphlets that he wrote was go directly to Cromwell. He couldn't go any higher at the time. And he asked him to get rid of all the lords of the manor throughout the country. I'm going to come back to this later. And of course, Cromwell didn't go along with that. But Gerrard Winstanley, coming from a royalist town of Wigan, actually became supportive of Cromwell and the Commonwealth, because he originally saw Cromwell as being a potential route for the changes that he wanted to make. But after Cromwell had been in power for a little while, he realised that Cromwell was no better than the king in terms of fundamentally changing the society that he wanted. So, given the fact that he went through this very difficult period in his life and became a radical, all the academic researchers say, but we don't know why he became a radical. What was the source of his radical views? So, as I said, what I've done here was go back to the history of Wigan and his family and trying to cast some more light on that. When he became bankrupt, after sailing through life at a fairly privileged level, he hit rock bottom. I don't know if any of you have hit rock bottom, I have, but I learned a lot from it. And that's what he did. He thought about the life that he experienced in Wigan and what Wiganers were doing, and realised that Wiganers were in fact supporting the same things that he decided he wanted to support too. The Wiganers were doing it on a town level, get rid of the lord of the manor, get rid of the gentry. So he took the views and expanded it, get rid of all the lords of the manor, get rid of all the gentry, get rid of the ruling classes. And he'd been brought up, as I mentioned, through a Winstanley family that had made the money through early capitalism. There was no coal mining then, well, a little bit, but not much. They'd earned the money in the wool and cloth trade, but they were basically early capitalists. And he went to London and became destitute as a result of following capitalism, so that was no solution to it. Wigan at the time, in the early 1600s, we don't have a detailed population count, but one of the historians has produced an estimate. There were probably only 3,000 people in Wigan at the time. That's not just Wigan, that's the whole parish of Wigan, which included Winstanley, Abram, Pemberton, Aspel, Ince, all those. So 3,000 people in the whole place. And despite people's views that Wigan was the dregs, if you look at some of the history, it was actually one of the better towns. They did pretty well for themselves compared with a lot of other people. But at least at the top level, they still left all the common people in poverty. So what was going on in Wigan? Going back to Wigan history a little bit, in 1246, well, back even before then, before William the Conqueror came over, all the people had access to all the land. There was no enclosure, no restrictions. William the Conqueror came over and started parcelling up the land to his French noblemen. And he put all his people controlling the church as well. So that's why in Wigan, the king granted a royal charter in 1246 and actually gave Wigan a lot of freedom. They could establish their own burgesses, the ruling group of the time in Wigan, and they could elect a mayor. And they could set up their own guilds, trades guilds, based on the London model. So after going through this for a couple of hundred years, the Wiganers realised that they were still getting screwed, that the rector was head of the church in Wigan, was also lord of the manor. I mean, he controlled everything. So they got fed up with all this control, they wanted more freedom. And they had a lot of struggles and appeals, but in 1618, they finally said, we've had enough of this. We want to get rid of the lord of the manor, change the whole system in Wigan. And that actually went up to the king, went right up to the king from Wigan. And the king appointed 4 arbiters, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Attorney General, and 2 Chief Justices. So they looked at it all and came back and made a decision saying, yes, the land, the Commons land around Wigan belongs to the rector and the lord of the manor, but all the common people need access to the commons for their own living. And there are a lot of artisans in Wigan at the time, a lot of potters, for example. And in this ruling from these arbiters, one thing they said, Wiganers have the right to dig clay on the commons. So Winstanley knew that, and I'm convinced that that was why the word diggers come up from. It was because Wiganers had demonstrated. They didn't get everything they wanted from the higher up, but they made significant progress in getting freedom and access to the resources, and they took collective action to do that. So Winstanley, in my mind, built on when he was destitute and looked back on what was happening in Wigan, took from Wigan and Wiganers what they were doing and did the same thing on a national scale. He went up to Cromwell and said, we've got to get rid of all the lords of the manors, and so on. So to me, the fundamental source of his radicalism is Wigan. Wigan is the source of socialism. And he was a very articulate guy, well connected in London, was well able to make connections and elevate it up to a higher level, and not afraid of going directly to Cromwell. And the heart of what the Diggers and Winstanley tried to do was based on concepts of justice and morality, what's right for the average person. And based on that philosophy, they established sort of a 3-part system that a lot of people have interpreted as communism, and that's rightly so, because he wanted to get rid of private property. He said everybody should share the resources, but everybody should work and have an opportunity to get their own resources, but not be responsible to higher levels. So yeah, he's justifiably designated as a founder of communism. But typically communism you don't associate with being religious. But he was very religious. But when he was brought up in Wigan under the parish church and the rector, nobody in Wigan at that time had any time to organise religion. In fact, in one of the history books it says that the rector used to ring the church bells at 10:30 every Sunday morning, and the church was empty, but all the Wiganers used to hear that bell, and they used to take it as an indication it was time to go to get into the sports. But the church was empty. So organised religion meant nothing except giving power and money to those that were the head of organised religion. So he rejected organised religion, but was still religious. And he ended up saying, true religion and God is within everybody. He believed that people and nature and God were all together. And the best way to live a good life is to understand yourself and your inner soul. Organised religion has its role, but ultimately it's up to you as an individual to find out what's right and what's wrong and live it that way. But he was also pacifist. And a lot of communist developments over the last century have certainly not been done by pacifists. They've been radical, revolutionary fighting. But that's something that Gerrard Winstanley never supported. He was a pacifist. So we've got a unique combination of communism, pacifism, and religion. That's what makes it so fascinating. So he was never successful in changing the world as he saw it. He got kicked out of this digging after about 18 months, but he carried on all his scholarly writing for a couple of years, which we've got all his documents now, and that's why we can understand him. And then after that he sort of gave up, and he became a church warden and a constable and a corn merchant in London, where he died. And some people even say he's the founder of the Quaker religion. I don't want to get that too much today, but that's another aspect of him. So I think my bottom line is, yeah, he did all these things. He's identified as the founder of communism with good cause, and socialism. But to me the biggest thing was he went through life, came through a very difficult period in his life, and learned from it. And he said, I don't like what's going on, and I'm going to do something about it. So in closing, I want to say, everybody, the same philosophy. You don't necessarily agree with everything that's going on, but if you sit on your rear end and do note, that makes us will be dear. So if you don't like what's going on, don't sit and mope and complain, do something about it. And you might get nailed and crucified in the process, but you might be successful too, and you'll never know till you try. So that's it.
Thanks, Derek, for that insight. Does anyone want to ask any questions of Derek, or can I invite Ian down to do his next bit?
All right, I'll have a chat with anybody.
Yeah. Okay. They probably want a few beers as well, won't they? Yeah, fair enough. I guess come all the way from America. So Ian, do you want to get down here and do your bit?